We are tracking a major shockwave moving through Russia's economy, one that rarely makes headlines but hits at the very heart of national power: logistics. The title says it all. Russia's all land bridges are gone. What does that really mean? It means supply lines are collapsing, transport routes are severed, and more than 10,000 trucks are now stuck. Unable to move goods, unable to earn, and unable to keep an entire industry alive. This is not just a traffic problem. This is an economic warning siren, and it's growing louder by the hour. Russia's logistics backbone is breaking down in a way that exposes a fundamental weakness rarely discussed in geopolitical debates. For years, the country's vast land transportation network was treated as an unshakable advantage, a symbol of scale and endurance that could withstand pressure from almost any direction. Roads, railways, and cross-border corridors were assumed to be permanent, reliable, and immune to disruption. What is unfolding now proves that assumption dangerously wrong. The disruption of key land routes is not a temporary inconvenience, but a structural shock that is forcing the entire economic system to confront its dependence on uninterrupted ground transport. Land corridors are the silent enablers of industrial life. They move raw materials to factories, finished goods to markets, fuel to power stations, and food to population centers. When even a small number of these routes fail, delays ripple outward. When multiple corridors are compromised at once, the system begins to seize. That is precisely what is happening. Restrictions, damage, rerouting, and rising costs have turned once efficient routes into bottlenecks. The result is not chaos in one region, but pressure across the entire national network, as freight is forced onto roads and rail lines never designed to carry such volume. The true scale of the problem becomes clear when viewed through the lens of dependency. Russia's internal supply chains are long and complex, spanning thousands of kilometers between production sites and consumers. Unlike smaller economies, there are few short alternatives when a major corridor is lost. Detours add days or weeks to delivery times, while fuel consumption and labor costs rise sharply. These added expenses are not absorbed quietly. They accumulate and spread, pushing transport companies to the edge and raising prices throughout the economy. What makes this breakdown especially alarming is how quickly confidence erodes once logistics falter. Manufacturers cannot plan output without reliable delivery schedules. Retailers cannot guarantee stock without predictable transport. Exporters cannot honor contracts when routes become uncertain or prohibitively expensive. Each failure compounds the next, creating a cycle where delays cause cancellations, cancellations cause losses, and losses weaken the very companies needed to keep goods moving. Logistics, often invisible in normal times, suddenly becomes the central constraint on economic activity. The assumption that alternative routes can simply replace lost land bridges ignores the limits of infrastructure. Secondary roads deteriorate under heavy loads, rail capacity is finite, and border crossings introduce new layers of cost and delay. Even when movement is technically possible, efficiency collapses. What once took 1 day now takes 3. What once required 1 truck now requires 2. Over time, this inefficiency drains capital, manpower, and resilience from the transport sector, leaving it less capable of responding to further shocks. This breakdown also exposes a strategic vulnerability that goes beyond economics. Control of territory and resources matters far less if they cannot be moved. Power projection, industrial output, and even domestic stability depend on the ability to transport goods reliably across land. When that ability weakens, the state's margin for error shrinks. Emergency responses become slower, regional disparities grow sharper, and the cost of maintaining normal operations rises across every sector. Perhaps most critically, the logistics collapse reveals how interconnected modern economies truly are. Land bridges do not function in isolation. They depend on political relationships, regional access, and stable cross-border arrangements. When those relationships fracture, physical infrastructure alone cannot compensate. Asphalt and steel are useless without permission, coordination, and trust. The current disruption shows that economic resilience is not just about size or resources, but about connectivity and continuity. Once that continuity is broken, even a vast transportation network can unravel with startling speed. The image of more than 10,000 cargo trucks sitting idle across vast stretches of territory is not just a striking visual, it is a direct measure of economic stress spreading through the system. Each stationary truck represents a failed movement of goods, a broken schedule, and a financial loss that grows larger with every passing hour. In an industry built on timing, volume, and constant motion, stillness is catastrophic. What is unfolding is not a short-term traffic disruption, but a sustained paralysis that is exposing how fragile the transport ecosystem becomes when normal routes collapse. For drivers, these delays are more than an inconvenience. Many are paid per delivery or per kilometer, meaning an idle truck often means zero income. Fuel continues to be consumed to maintain heating, refrigeration, or basic engine functions, while food, lodging, and maintenance costs accumulate. Drivers face penalties for missed deadlines despite having no control over the conditions causing the delays. Over time, this pressure pushes individuals out of the profession, worsening labor shortages in an industry already stretched thin. Transport companies are absorbing the heaviest blow. Contracts are written around guaranteed delivery windows, and failure to meet them triggers fines, lost clients, or outright contract termination. Insurance policies rarely cover geopolitical disruptions or route closures, leaving firms fully exposed to losses. Leasing payments on trucks continue regardless of whether vehicles are moving, and banks expect repayments even as revenue collapses. For small and mid-sized logistics firms, which operate on narrow margins, weeks of immobilization. The stranded trucks also represent cargo that cannot reach its destination. Perishable goods spoil. Industrial components fail to arrive on time, forcing factories to slow or halt production. Retail supply chains face gaps that quickly translate into shortages and price increases. What begins as a transport issue rapidly becomes a consumer issue, as delays at the logistics level translate into empty shelves and rising costs for everyday goods. There is also a cascading effect on supporting industries. Fuel suppliers lose predictable demand patterns. Maintenance and repair services see delayed payments or canceled contracts. Warehousing facilities fill beyond capacity, as inbound shipments cannot move forward. Even administrative services, from customs brokers to freight forwarders, experience sudden drops in activity. The paralysis of trucks ripples outward, touching sectors that rarely make headlines but are essential to economic stability. The scale of immobilization undermines confidence across the market. Businesses that rely on just-in-time delivery models are forced to reassess their dependence on domestic land transport. Some begin seeking alternative suppliers, while others reduce output to avoid accumulating unsellable inventory. International partners take note as well, questioning the reliability of commitments when thousands of vehicles are visibly unable to move. Trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild in logistics, where reputation is as valuable as capacity. Perhaps most damaging is the psychological impact on the industry itself. Logistics thrives on predictability and planning. When drivers, managers, and clients cannot anticipate when or whether goods will move, decision-making becomes reactive rather than strategic. Investment is postponed, fleet upgrades are canceled, and expansion plans are shelved. The industry shifts from growth to survival mode, focusing on minimizing losses rather than improving efficiency. The sight of 10,000 stranded trucks is therefore not merely a statistic, but a warning signal. It reflects a system where motion has been interrupted on a massive scale, revealing the tight margins and deep interdependence that define modern transport. When trucks stop, the economy does not slow gradually. It stutters, then strains, and finally begins to fracture under the weight of accumulated delay. The slide of the transportation industry toward bankruptcy is unfolding quietly but relentlessly, driven by pressures that compound day after day. Unlike headline-grabbing market crashes, this collapse is measured in unpaid invoices, missed loan payments, and fleets that slowly disappear from the road. Transport is a high-volume, low-margin business even in stable times. When disruption becomes prolonged, the financial math simply stops working. Revenue depends on constant movement, yet costs continue whether a truck travels 1,000 kilometers or remains parked for weeks. Fuel expenses illustrate the problem clearly. Prices remain volatile, and even stationary vehicles consume fuel for heating, refrigeration, and basic operation. Drivers must be housed, fed, and compensated, while routes that remain open are longer and more expensive. These costs cannot always be passed on to clients, especially when contracts were signed under very different assumptions. The gap between operating expenses and incoming payments widens rapidly, leaving companies to absorb losses they were never structured to survive. Credit conditions are making the situation worse. Many transport firms rely on loans or leasing arrangements to maintain fleets. Trucks are expensive assets, and monthly payments do not pause during crises. Banks and leasing companies demand repayment on schedule, and missed installments trigger penalties or repossession. As vehicles are seized or sold at a loss, capacity shrinks further, reducing revenue potential and accelerating the downward spiral. What begins as a liquidity issue quickly becomes a solvency crisis. Insurance adds another layer of strain. Premiums have surged as risk assessments change, particularly for routes affected by instability or restrictions. Some insurers refuse coverage altogether, forcing companies to self-insure or halt operations. Without coverage, even a minor accident or cargo loss can be financially fatal. Firms are forced into impossible choices: operate without adequate protection or stop moving entirely, and accept guaranteed losses. The workforce is also caught in this financial squeeze. Delayed wages, reduced hours, and uncertain schedules push drivers and logistics professionals to seek more stable employment elsewhere. Training new drivers is costly and time-consuming, and the loss of experienced personnel undermines operational efficiency. As staffing levels fall, remaining workers are stretched thinner, increasing the risk of errors, accidents, and further financial liabilities. Small and mid-sized operators are the most vulnerable. Large logistics companies may have diversified routes, stronger cash reserves, or government backing, but smaller firms often serve specific corridors or clients. When those routes fail, their entire business model collapses. Bankruptcy filings in this segment tend to rise first, creating consolidation not through growth, but through failure. Communities that depend on these companies for employment and local services feel the impact almost immediately. The broader economy feels the consequences of an industry pushed to the brink. Transport companies are not isolated entities. They are connective tissue linking producers, sellers, and consumers. As bankruptcies mount, service gaps appear, delivery times lengthen, and costs rise across supply chains. Inflationary pressure increases as scarcity replaces abundance, and the state is faced with difficult choices between intervention, subsidies, or allowing market forces to run their course. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the erosion of future capacity. Once companies go bankrupt, fleets are sold, staff disperse, and expertise is lost. Rebuilding that capacity is neither quick nor cheap. Even if routes reopen or conditions improve, the infrastructure of companies and relationships needed to restart operations may no longer exist. The transportation industry's financial collapse is therefore not just a reflection of current disruption, but a threat to long-term economic recovery and stability.
All traffic lights in that railway block automatically switch to fail-safe mode. According to data verified by AP News, more than 145 such acts of sabotage and arson have occurred across Russia and on the European border. When these cabinets burn, the system goes blind. Trains must stop. Passage is only possible in manual mode, via radio commands, at a snail's pace of 10 kilometers per hour. Military logistics, which should flow at 80 kilometers per hour, suddenly comes to a standstill. A queue of hundreds of trains forms behind. Without firing a single bullet, the partisans managed to reduce the Russian army's supply speed by 80% with just a lighter. Technical bankruptcy inevitably turns into an economic and systemic heart attack. Russian Railways is not just a transport company, it is the backbone of the Russian state. This backbone is currently being crushed under the weight of a financial collapse. RZD's net loss for the first 9 months of 2025 and its 40% cut in investment programs reveal the scale of the crisis.
Investment shifts away from sectors perceived as risky, reducing innovation and modernization. Over time, the industrial base becomes narrower and less competitive, limiting future growth potential. Strategic industries that once underpinned economic strength lose their advantage when supply chains cannot be secured. Military and emergency readiness are indirectly affected as well. Civilian logistics and strategic mobility are closely linked, sharing infrastructure, personnel, and planning systems. When civilian transport networks are strained, the capacity to respond quickly to emergencies or mobilize resources is diminished. This overlap means that economic logistics vulnerabilities can translate into broader security concerns, even without direct confrontation. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this vulnerability is how quickly it becomes self-reinforcing. As reliability declines, trust erodes among businesses, workers, and international partners. Reduced trust leads to reduced engagement, fewer investments, and more cautious planning. These responses, while rational individually, collectively deepen isolation and inefficiency. The system adapts downward, normalizing lower performance and accepting constraints that would once have been unacceptable. The situation underscores a fundamental reality of the modern world. Power is not only measured by what a country possesses, but by what it can move, sell, and sustain over time. Secure land bridges and stable trade access are not logistical details. They are strategic assets. When those assets are weakened, the effects ripple across the economy, society, and long-term prospects, exposing vulnerabilities that cannot be easily concealed or quickly repaired. Remember, this headline isn't about roads or trucks. It's about leverage, vulnerability, and economic reality. When land bridges disappear, power weakens. When transport collapses, industries fall with it. Russia's transportation sector is sounding an alarm, and whether that warning is heard or ignored may define the next chapter of its economic future. We'll continue to follow this story closely. Good night, and stay informed.